So it is time for my January wrap up, and I managed to complete 14 books in the month of January, which I am super happy about. But I appreciate that that means that this video is probably going to be quite long. I have 14 books to talk about and I will try to be brief, but it might just take me a little while to get through these 14, and that does seem to be kind of the average amount of books that I'm reading per month now. So I'm going to put a little poll up here and I want you to let me know, do you prefer me to just do one wrap up of all the books that I read in a month at the end of a month, or would it be more useful for you for me to wrap up, say, every time I finish 5 books, wrap up those 5 books in a slightly longer format so that the videos are the same amount of length, but you get more information about each of the books, or potentially the video will be slightly shorter, but you still get more information about the books. So let me know. I'm happy to do either. It just occurred to me that these videos are potentially getting quite long and I'm talking about quite a lot of books in them, so it might be more useful if I break it down. So I'd be really grateful if you would let me know by voting in this poll. But without any further ado, let's get into it. As always, I'm going to start with the books that I don't have physical copies of so that I don't forget to talk about them. And the first one of those is An Unkindness of Ghosts by Rivers Solomon, which is a young adult slash adult. It's kind of the higher end of young adult science fiction, although the science fiction elements aren't really the main focus of the story. So in An Unkindness of Ghosts, we follow Asta, who is kind of a trainee doctor on a spaceship that is travelling across the universe to find a new place to live because Earth is no longer habitable. And unfortunately, the society aboard this spaceship is very, very racist, frankly. The white people in this society are the aristocracy, as it were, the higher class, the well-fed, well-kept, lots of money, highly privileged part of society, whilst the black community is very much downtrodden and in essential slavery. They do all of the dangerous jobs, they do all of the difficult jobs, they're the ones slaving away in the fields or slaving away in the somewhat futuristic engine room, and they live in cold conditions, they live in oppression. It is very, very dark. It is very, very reminiscent of black slavery, and that's why I say that it's on the higher end of the young adult spectrum, because some of the themes are very difficult to read. A lot of the characters, if not all of the characters, are deeply, deeply traumatized. They've been abused, they continue to be treated really badly, and it's a lot of very dark stuff, made worse by the fact that it's all based in things that happened to actual people, although the location is not one that humans have lived in. We don't have spaceships that travel across the universe, but the situations our characters are put into is unfortunately very reminiscent of things that have actually happened to real people at the hands of other real people, and that's what makes it quite a difficult book to read. We also have a character who is potentially on the autism spectrum, although that's never specifically said, and so her narration is quite different and introspective, and she just has a very different way of looking at the world, which potentially makes it an even more difficult read from both an emotional perspective and a content perspective and an actual reading it perspective. And the main sort of plot, and I hesitate to say this because it's really not, in my opinion, a book about plot, it's a book about characters, but the main kind of driving force to the story is that Asta finds a journal that has been left behind by her mother, who committed suicide, and she starts to unlock clues from her mother's journal and kind of follows those to an end that I'm not going to say anything else about. It's a difficult read. It's not going to be for everyone. I struggled with it a little bit. I couldn't get hold of a physical copy, so I had to listen to the audio, which made it more difficult. I think I would have found it a lot easier to read this one physically, so bear that in mind. Not that the audiobook isn't great, it is, it's just the kind of story that I feel like I needed to consume with my eyes rather than with my ears. But if it sounds interesting to you, give it a go, just bear all of those potential trigger warnings in mind. The other book I read that I don't have a physical copy of is The Proposal by Meg Cabot, which is a novella between books 6 and 7 of the Mediator series, and you can tell from the title what the story is. I don't want to say anything more than that because this will be massive spoilers for the end of the original series if you haven't read it, which follows a character named Susanna Simon, who is a mediator, which means that she can see and speak to ghosts, and it's her job to help them move on to wherever it is they go. And it's a series I love. I picked up the novella just because it was available on Scribd as an ebook and I kind of wanted to see what it was about. So I read it, nothing miraculous, it was enjoyable. It's a very, very short book. I think it's like 120 pages, 125 pages, something like that. But I enjoyed myself. Now getting into the books that I have physical copies of, I'm not going to talk about these in the order that I read them. I have them stacked next to me and I'm just going to talk about them as they come to my hand, as always. So the first one we're going to discuss is Monstrous, Volume 1 by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda, which is a graphic novel, as you can probably tell, and it's a little bit difficult to say what this one is about because we really only start to touch the surface of what it's about in volume 1, so I definitely need to read more volumes. But the artwork in this is absolutely stunning. I mean, just look at this cover. Isn't it beautiful? And the content is even more beautiful, so I highly recommend it just for the art. It is fantasy based and it kind of has steampunk kind of vibes, and I really enjoyed it, especially the art, like I said, and I do want to continue with the series to try and understand a little bit better what is going on. I will say there's a lot of quite graphic stuff in this. It's pretty dark, so bear that in mind if you want to pick it up. I reread The Quiet at the End of the World by Lauren James. I listened to this on audiobook and thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a book that I discovered for the first time last year, and it was actually the first Lauren James book that I read, so it felt fitting to reread this one first too. It follows two characters, Shen and Lowry, who are the last young people on Earth after a virus has caused mass infertility, and if the adults can't figure out a cure for this infertility, then Shen and Lowry will be the last people alive on Earth, and so we follow them as they come to terms with what that means for them and their future. I think my favourite elements of this story are the mysterious elements and the relationships between the characters, and I don't want to say any more than that because I feel like this is one of those books that the less you know the better going into it. Just know that the writing is fantastic and I highly recommend it. The next two I'm going to mention only very briefly because I actually included both of these books in a 24-hour reading vlog that I did not too long ago, so I will link that up here. And I, in that vlog, read The Thief by Megan Wallen-Turner and Love and Gelato by Jenna Evans-Welch, which are very, very different books. So starting with Love and Gelato, this one follows Lena, whose mother passes away, and so she goes out to Italy to meet her father, who she's never met before and didn't know who he even was until her mother passed away. And she gets to know her father, she gets to know herself a little bit better, and she finds love. That's all I'll say. Very cute, very easy to read, very enjoyable. The Thief follows Jen, who at the beginning of the story is in prison, and he is released so that he can steal a much sought after artifact. And it's very, very short, so I'm not going to say anything more than that, but this is a really fun, fantasy story. Like I said, it's very short, which is really, really different for fantasy, and I actually really liked the fact that this was so straight to the point. It was very much focused on plot and character development rather than world building, although there is some of that too. It's really not the focus, and that's very different. Often in fantasy you get a whole lot of world building and info dumping in terms of that world building, and this book doesn't have that, and I actually didn't miss it. I quite enjoyed that kind of different vibe that we got with this one, so I'm really looking forward to continuing with the series. Then we have A Heart So Fierce and Broken by Brigid Kemmerer, which is the sequel to A Curse So Dark and Lonely, which came out last year and which I read last year. And book 1 was a Beauty and the Beast retelling. Book 2 is we've really gone beyond that, and we're following 2 new perspectives, not new characters. One of the characters is in book 1, but we don't read from their perspective in book 1, and we now read from their perspective in book 2, and we're also introduced to a new character whose perspective we follow. I can't tell you anything more about what this one is about because it's a sequel, and like I said, book 1 is a Beauty and the Beast retelling with kind of a portal fantasy vibe, because our Beauty, Harker, is from our world and she's transported into the world of Emberfall, which is where the Beast resides. And this one is very, very different. I didn't like this one as much as book 1, but I did still enjoy it. Book 1 is very fast-paced and straightforward, and you can tell where the story's going, and that makes it comforting and easy to read, and I liked that. This one can't do that because it's not a retelling, so you don't know where the story's going, and so I kind of missed that in a way from the first one, and it meant that the writing wasn't quite as straightforward, and there was quite a long portion at the beginning of the book where I was thinking, well, where is this going? What is the point? And then we kind of got there and I started to really enjoy it, and then the end of the book made me need the next one. I actually, when I picked this up, I thought it was a duology, so I thought that this was the conclusion of the story, and then I started to get into it and I was like, there's an awful lot to wrap up here. How is she going to do it? And then I realised, no, this is book 2 of a trilogy. So yeah, that came as a horrible shock to my system because I now need to wait a whole year until the next one is out. Great. Now to talk about the first book I actually read this year, which was The Alloy of Law by Brandon Sanderson, which is the bridge book between Mistborn Era 1 and Era 2, although technically you can just call this book 1 of the second era, and it follows 2 characters, Wax and Wayne, who are kind of like detectives, and they are trying to uncover the mystery of some women that are going missing and some items that are being stolen and what's going on with all of that. And of course it's Mistborn, so it's got allomancy in it, which is fabulous. It's also got feruchemy, so if you know what feruchemy is and you've read Mistborn Era 1, feruchemy is present here as well. Hemorrhagy is mentioned but isn't used, although I think that it will be used in the later part of this second era, so I guess we'll see how that goes. I didn't enjoy this as much as first era. It's not quite as epic fantasy in tone. You can kind of tell that just from the length, to be honest, but also it's what's called flintlock fantasy, I think. I don't really know what that means other than it involves guns, and it does involve guns, which is interesting when your magic system involves manipulation of metals. And our protagonist, Wax or Waxilium, is an allomancer. Both of our characters are allomancers, and Waxilium's allomancy allows him to push metals with his mind. So you can see how with the addition of guns that would be interesting, and it was, and I'm really looking forward to continuing with Era 2. Next up we have We Are Okay by Nina LaCour, which is a contemporary book, and in this we follow Marin, whose been raised by her grandfather, and then her grandfather dies and she can't cope with it, so she runs away, and her friend comes to track her down to try and get Marin to talk about what it is that she's struggling with, and Marin has to sort of face some things that she's been hiding away from, and it's really emotional and difficult read. It deals with grief, as you might expect, so be aware of that, and it deals with depression, again, as you might expect, but again, be aware of that. It's very, very short, but very, very insightful and hard-hitting. It's hard-hitting contemporary. It's called that for a reason. I really, really enjoyed it. It was a difficult read, but a worthwhile read in my opinion, 100%. Next up we have a very different kind of contemporary, and that is Love Boat Taipei by Abigail Hingwen, which is sort of a romance contemporary, kind of. Its own voices, which is great, so the representation in this is fabulous and I really enjoyed that. I didn't hugely get on with our main character ever. Some of her decision making was difficult for me. There's kind of a love triangle, sort of, in this, and I just feel like the way that she treats certain people and the way that she makes certain decisions wasn't the best, so I didn't love that. It made me struggle with certain sections of this story, but I do think it's a fantastic book. It's actually a debut novel, I believe, which is great. It's really well written. It follows Eva, whose family has massive expectations of her. They want her to go to medical school to become a doctor because her father is a qualified doctor but was never able to practice because they moved to the United States from Taiwan, and so he wasn't able to afford to sit the exams that you have to sit to be able to practice medicine in the United States. I don't really know how that works, but he couldn't practice in the United States. So Eva's parents have put their dreams on her. It just isn't what she wants from life, and she struggles with that. And so when she goes to Taipei to go to this summer camp, which does not take place on a boat, by the way, that confused me for a hot minute, so just to avoid confusion if you decide to read this one, there's no boat, that's just what it's called by the people who attend. It's fully on land, but it's the summer camp, and she kind of just goes a little bit wild. And like I said, she makes some decisions that I wasn't totally on board with. On board, again, no boat. But I did really enjoy reading this, and I do definitely recommend it, if for nothing else than the representation, because like I said, it's own voices, so the representation is really great. Another book that I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on is The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. I have a full review for this book up on my channel, so I will link that up there for you. It is a science fiction mystery where our main character spends each day in the body of another person at this manor house where a murder takes place, and he has to use these 7 days to figure out who the murderer is. Otherwise he has to restart the loop all over again with no memory of what happened the first time round. And I had some issues with this one. Mostly the fat phobia that was contained in this book made me really struggle with it. So I'm not going to say anything else because, like I said, I've got a whole review of this one. So if you're interested in my in-depth thoughts, I will send you to watch that. Next up we have Dracula by Bram Stoker, which is of course a classic and the original vampire story, and I struggled with it, if I'm being perfectly honest. This was our book club book for January. I know a lot of us felt very similarly, particularly about the pacing of this one. I'm not going to bother telling you what the plot is because I feel like you probably know what the plot is. It's Dracula, and I would say probably the first 75-ish pages were really good. It's a really atmospheric book, and the first section was incredibly ominous and dark, and I was really enjoying it. And then the pace just slowed right down, and we had probably, I would say, about 100 to 200 pages where really not a lot was happening, and I didn't really know where the story was going or what the purpose of anything that was happening was. And at that point the story picked back up again and was really well paced, probably I'd say for another 150 pages, and then it slowed back down again, and then the ending happened in like a page. So I feel like this is one of those books that could have done with being half the length. If we had just stuck to the well-paced sections of the story, I would have really enjoyed this a lot more than I did. I'm still glad I read it, I still liked it, but there were huge sections that I feel like just did not need to be there, and that really took away from the story for me, which is a real shame, because the bits that I liked, I really liked, but the bits that I didn't like were just so boring and really dragged the book down in my opinion, which, like I say, is a real shame. But I am glad I read it. And then the final book that I read in January was The Queen of Nothing by Holly Black, which is book 3 in the Folk of the Air trilogy, so it's the final book in the series, and this is potentially an unpopular opinion, but this was my favourite book in the whole series. It's very short, as you can see. I think all of the books in the series are short. This one comes in at 305 pages, which I think is the shortest in the series, but that didn't bother me. I felt that the pacing of this was really good because we kind of just got to the point all the time, and that's kind of what I like about this series. Is much like with The Thief, what I was talking about earlier, we don't spend a whole lot of time setting things up, we just kind of get straight to the point. It is a very plot focused story, but there is character building as well. As always, can't tell you what this one is about, but the first book follows predominantly Jude, who is human, but she has a half-fae sister, and when her half-fae sister's father murders Jude's mortal parents, he ends up kind of adopting her twin sister and her half-fae sister, so they grow up in the land of fairy, where they're treated pretty badly, to be honest. There's a reason book 1 is called The Cruel Prince, because the fae are pretty horrible to humans, and Jude doesn't particularly like that. She's been raised by a warrior, and so she's very much of that mindset herself, and she really grows throughout the series. But I don't know, I find it difficult to talk about the reasons I liked this book without spoilers, but just know that I really enjoyed it. I found the ending very satisfying, I found the pacing really great. There were some elements that I didn't like, there were some relationships that I kind of thought might have been resolved a little bit too cleanly, but on the whole I thoroughly enjoyed myself reading this one. And isn't this Folio edition just stunning? It was a pleasure to read this edition, but this book was also great. And that's it. Those are the 14 books that I read in the month of January. Don't forget to vote up above on whether or not you want me to continue filming wrap-ups like this or to break them down. But that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you again soon. Thanks. Bye!